Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your weekly source for the top four wildlife news stories and interviews with wildlife newsmakers. In today's episode, we talk about grizzly bears, zombie elk, porpoises, porpellini, never mind, Florida man, and Dr. Marc Bekoff joins us.
So we are here. We're back from the holidays. How was your Christmas, Mark?
I had a wonderful month of Christmas, as I always do. Four Christmases takes a long time, but we're done, and it finished off in grand fashion, where we were in Hiawassee, Georgia, where my mom lives, and we were able to get up to Brasstown Bald, which is the highest point in Georgia, which is about 4,700 feet high.
Wow.
Yeah, explaining that the highest point in Georgia, which is a sizable mountain, is still lower than where I live on the flatland of Colorado, was kind of a mind-blowing thought for her.
Oh, nice. What did Sophia say? Did you explain to her with a topo map, or how did you explain this to her?
I just kind of left it.
Okay.
You know,
Left the mystery alive. Okay.
you can only do so much with a 6-year-old, but it was a really beautiful experience. We got up there real early in the morning. It's always super foggy up there. We can't even tell, am I in the cloud or am I in the fog? But it's a very lush landscape and basically like a rainforest up there. So we didn't get to see much of a view once we got to the top. It was all socked in, but it was a vastly different experience than we get to have here in Colorado. So I really appreciate spending time in the North Georgia woods when I can.
Yeah.
What'd you get into?
Oh, I got into so many things, Mark. I don't have my kid with me this year for Christmas, so I actually got to do a lot of skiing. I saw an adorable pine marten while I was out getting a Christmas tree during the holidays. And I can finally ski down the cross country hill that's like the basic hill without falling. So I'm really improving my game and ready to be outside again a little bit more and enjoy the Colorado snow.
Yeah, you know that going downhill on cross country skis, it's it's hard to explain to someone who hasn't done it, but the excitement factor, I think, is a good 20-fold over the same slope on downhill skis.
Yeah, they're very skinny. They're very skinny. Luckily, there's usually a little track that you just stay in with your cross country skis, but it's certainly a learning curve. Every year when I start back up, I definitely fall on my face at least twice. And hopefully I've got that out of the way now and can just ski and enjoy being outside.
Well, it's always good to know if the snow tastes the same as it did last year.
I feel like it was a little more fresh this year. But tis life, tis life in the high Rockies. So speaking of changes in years, I wanted to share my first news story of the day, which is it's a real roller coaster. It's a bit of a mixed bag. And that's about our southern resident orcas that live right outside Washington. They're very famous, but there's a very few of them left. So there's only about 70 of these orcas left. And they're having a lot of issues as far as finding and eating food. Their traditional food is salmon, but they prefer wild salmon because wild salmon will grow larger than hatchery salmon. So even though the state actually puts out hatchery fish, the orcas won't necessarily eat those fish. So we have orcas there that have a food problem that we're losing actually the species because of this food shortage. And there certainly are some reforms needed about that. But there were two things that happened. One was that we lost one of those calves within that J pod. And unfortunately, it's tied again to malnutrition and to a shortage of food. The mother orca in that pod is again carrying that calf. A few years back, she had a calf that died, and we saw all of the pictures of her carrying the calf to mourn the calf around outside of Seattle. Like this pod is very close to where humans are. And so humans really get to see the full display of grief and the capacity of grief for these animals. But on the other side of that coin is that the pod also welcomed a new calf. So they lost one, another one is here, but ultimately, for large species like this, it's these huge industries like fishing, like the boat noise that goes across the harbor there, that's really hurting these animals, and thinking about how can we perform what we do as humans so they don't experience the losses that they're experiencing at this rate. And I think the new calf is great news, but the loss of the other calf to the same mother orca that had lost a calf before, of course, is really devastating.
That is devastating, and it's so sad to hear about the mother mourning, and but sad and relatable, and obviously, if a human mother lost her young or her baby, um, she would be doing the same thing. And it really just goes to show how sentient these animals are, and how much they care for their young. So you said that they were resident to that area. So is that common for, do you know if it's common for orcas to generally stay in the same area, or do they move around more if needed?
So it depends on the pod. Orcas are really fascinating in that they have different cultures in all of their different pods. So some orcas will eat seals, some orcas will only eat salmon. There are some migrant orcas that will come in and out of that area, but they don't necessarily live there. Their main prey is marine mammals, for that non-resident group that comes in and out of the area. But the resident group does stay right along that coastline there, right by the San Juans and down to Seattle, and then back up by Vancouver. So they actually stay really close to the shoreline there and go back and forth. And their culture again is to eat, and we call whales preferences culture because they are very sentient in that way. Is to eat wild salmon, large wild salmon, and they don't leave that area and they don't change the food that they eat. So that's the very fascinating thing about them, is that even as we're seeing losses, we're not seeing the whales adapt and eat other food that's available. And we're also seeing a lot of increased stress from increased shipping traffic across that area.
Interesting. Do they also suffer from boat strikes?
I don't know about that. We'd have to look into that a bit. I haven't heard a lot of boat strikes. There are a lot of regulations around how close you can be to those orcas, and it's a big deal once you see them. Everyone in town starts talking about it, that the J-pod's back. Who are we going to see? A lot of folks track these orcas and are invested in their future. And I know a lot of folks are upset again that the mother Taliqua had lost another calf, and we'll probably see some frustrated advocates expressing the need for reforms again around shipping. When we're moving things back and forth, that noise impacts whales in a disproportionate way, and it really causes deep stress. And then they can't communicate with each other either, which is really hard on them.
Yeah, I imagine. You J-Pod sounds like J-Pod's back in town. Sounds like a band, like Jurassic 5 coming back. Jurassic 5 demands only salmon.
They are, it's true. They have big demands on what they will eat, and they will only eat big salmon, and they're incredibly endangered. And I think, this is kind of a line with both my news stories this year, is that we're seeing the impacts of our existence on these larger animals that we live with. And I think that that's a warning bell for all of us to think, how can we change our behavior to support these species, and what can we do? And with the orcas, we certainly need to look at shipping and hatchery reforms for sure. But sad story. Glad we have another calf here. And I'm hopeful that as humans, we can make some changes so these really charismatic large mammals can survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And the human impact piece of it segues into my first story, which comes out of Wyoming. And they have recently found tested for their positive for their first case of chronic wasting disease in their elk herd.
Wow.
And scientists and hunters and conservationists, everyone has been really worrying about this happening in Wyoming, specifically because they feed the elk in the winter. So, just outside of Jackson Hole, there is the National Elk Refuge there, and it's a huge feeding ground. About 5,000 elk feed there every winter. So they're in close quarters. And so any kind of disease can spread rapidly throughout the herd. And I was looking a bit into the origin story of these feeding grounds. Like, why are we even doing this? And it's the human impact side. So the feeding grounds started because ranchers wanted elk off of their property. And so we set up these places that are both federal and state level feeding grounds, but the National Elk Refuge is the largest one in the state there. And so, for those that don't know what chronic wasting disease is, it's a prion disease. So it is 100% fatal when an animal contracts it. It started in elk herd, or in deer herds, and then now is moving to elk, and down the road, who knows, it may get into moose as well. But it's going to take some rethinking of, are these feeding grounds the right thing to do? Is it necessary? And what kind of impact, both for the ecosystems themselves and then also on hunting, are these? How is it going to impact these elk herds once it fully gets into them and starts killing hundreds or thousands of elk?
And chronic wasting disease, we call that the zombie deer disease, right? Because ultimately it destroys the animal's brain to the point where the animal wastes away to next to nothing and is walking in circles, will almost drink too much water to death to that point. So the animals look very sick after the disease is fully set in. And one of the things that scares me about the prions in this disease is that they can live on the ground for years after.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if any deer or elk has the disease and they're not showing symptoms yet, and they use the restroom of the forest floor, the next animal that grazes there can actually catch the disease for years. And I think it's really terrifying. I think the other scary part about chronic wasting disease is that it does have a lot of zoonotic potential. It's closely related to mad cow disease. So that means that it has the potential that it could transfer from ungulates, where it lives now, to humans at some point. Um, but again, the practices that we're doing as humans is really contributing to the spread of this disease. And I feel like a lot of times as humans, we are charging, using a credit card to pay for the environment. We're charging a debt that we can't pay back to prop up these systems that aren't sustainable in the long term. I think the deer and elk feeding is one of those. It happens in other states too, beyond Wyoming, and it causes a lot of issues. And then same thing with hatchery fish and fishing, like we saw with the orcas. We're creating systems that solve a problem temporarily or look like we're doing something, but we're not getting to the root of the issue, which is dangerous.
Science and scientists do a lot of amazing work, but as people, we we tend to meddle with things that were working perfectly fine before and hope for a better result. Often, the end result is something much worse. So, in this case, righting a wrong of creating these dense feeding grounds, I think is probably going to be the only path forward. I don't know what that looks like as far as these elk that migrate there every year, and if they're showing up in herds of 5,000, and there's nothing there for them to eat, that's obviously going to be an issue. So, our state officials in Wyoming and our federal officials are certainly going to have a big task in front of them, hopefully trying to wean them off of this kind of feeding and maybe get them spread out a little bit more and healthier that way. I'm fearful of what this could turn into in Wyoming, and hopefully we can mitigate its impacts before they become devastating to the entire herds in that area. So
Right. So CWD, chronic wasting disease, don't we have that? We have it here in Colorado where we live. For sure. We were ground zero for chronic wasting disease. I know that cases have popped up, maybe one in Washington. Are there some in Idaho? Where else is the disease present now?
So yeah, Sam, that's an excellent point. So it's actually found throughout the country in the West, Midwest, South, and also in the Northeast. And it's even been reported in reindeer and moose and Canadian provinces, as well as even in Norway, Finland, and Sweden now. So it is not a localized issue that it once was, when it escaped the lab in Colorado and is sweeping around the world.
Wow. Yeah, I think we've got some reckoning to do as human beings, to be better stewards of the environment to prevent things like that from happening and spreading and seeing what we can do now. Want to talk about another charismatic megafauna, excellent carnivore?
Yeah.
I'm here today to talk to you about Florida panthers too, Mark. What do you think about
Ooh.
panthers?
I think that panthers are awesome.
Well, I have learned some cool things about Florida panthers, who were incredibly endangered. They were down to just, I think, 50 or so panthers left at some point, maybe even less than that. And they've recovered to more than 200 panthers now in the wild, which is great. They had a panther that actually swam across this river. They were worried about the Florida panther population not being able to expand northward because of a gigantic river there. And they had a female panther cross the river and have kittens on the other side of the river. And they are now expanding beyond where they originally were. There's a really cool corridor project around these animals that are working with all sorts of different groups of people, everyone from ranchers to environmentalists to, the highway system, all working on how do we support this really incredible carnivore on the landscape because we need them here. And I was watching an interview with one of the livestock producers in Florida, and he was saying how he felt that the future of his industry was tied directly to the future of the panther because they both need those open spaces to survive. And he took a lot of ownership over wanting to be a good steward for panther, for, I'm going to mess up. What am I thinking? Panther habitat. There we go. He took a lot of ownership over wanting to be a good steward for panther habitat. And what they've found too is what they really need to work on again is even more corridors, improving the highway system. So while we see a great success story here, the largest issue panthers are facing today are vehicle strikes. So we actually lost 36 Florida panthers last year to vehicle strikes. Only 4 panthers were lost to other predators or conflicts with panthers themselves, and 1 was lost to a train strike.
Where does Florida Man rank in facing panthers and their demise?
Well, I think Florida man, it depends on the day of the year. He could be out there with a chainsaw making corridors. He could be fighting a gator. We don't know. We don't know. But the
We need
panther,
we need Florida Man here to answer some questions.
we do need Florida man here. But the good news is the panthers are really, they have the opportunity to be a great conservation success story. And what I do love is that you see a full community of people coming together to try to foster this animal's success and ultimately help it reclaim its original territory.
I love that so many agencies and people from all walks of life are helping to make this happen. but for this beautiful endangered animal. It, at the same time, I wish that kind of mentality and effort would go just to protect wild corridors everywhere.
Right.
We don't have to have that charismatic species be the impetus for making big change in how we view wildlife corridors. The wildlife corridors should be up there with sidewalks as far as how we structure, how we build our societies.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mark. And I think that what we see with these charismatic species, with these larger animals, is they're symbolic of really the plight of all the animals down the food chain. And I think that's a theme through each of our news stories today is that what we see at the top, because they're larger animals, they're animals we're paying attention to, it really speaks to issues that can be happening down at the micro level too. And as humans, we need to do a better job stewarding that.
Absolutely. And speaking of charismatic species, I have one for you.
I'm ready. Which one?
So, if not friend, why friend shaped? I am talking about the grizzly bear. So there is a big decision coming around grizzlies' endangered status coming on January 20th. So back in December, a judge gave a decision for a 45-day deadline for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services to determine whether or not they are going to remove them from the ESA and give control back to states for quote management, which I think we all know what that means is opening up hunting season.
Yeah, management is killing. And unfortunately, that's how state agencies seem to favor managing wildlife. I think that a lot of the public doesn't know that when an agency says management, they generally mean killing, not, fostering healthy populations. So what is your take, Mark? Do you think that our friends, the Grizz, have a chance, or do you think that we'll downlist them and see what's happened to wolves really in the Northern Rockies start to happen to grizzly bears?
The wolves doesn't don't set a great precedent for the grizzlies to remain protected. In Yellowstone, in the greater Yellowstone area, they have come back wonderfully. There's no longer any fears within the park for their populations to be finished. So I don't have super optimistic feelings about it uh, because of the wolves, because of the pressure I'm sure that Wyoming is putting on this U.S. District Court to get it back in their hands, and we'll see what happens. But I'm not excited about it. What are your thoughts?
We'll have to pay close attention to what happens to grizzly bears and other species. We have an administration coming in that's not wildlife friendly as far as our federal government administration. We have, the president's son himself is a trophy hunter, and we know he's hunted lions with hounds. That's something that we're familiar with right here in the United States. And I'm sure he would hunt a grizzly bear too if given the opportunity. So again, I am saddened by this situation. I think that the Endangered Species Act is there to recover populations, but we're still seeing grizzlies really in a fraction of the range that they once inhabited. I mean, we had them here in Colorado before. We don't have them here now. We had them in Washington. They're not there. We had them in California, not there. So I think to say, go ahead.
Yeah,
You
no,
gave a face. Go ahead.
I just had an epiphany. So when you said that we had them in Colorado, so the last grizzly bear in Colorado was killed, I believe, in the 1970s by a man with a knife.
Wow.
So
That's a battle. Was it Anthony Hopkins?
it might as well have been.
Okay.
So maybe if you want to hunt grizzly, you can do it but you have to
With your
have
bare hands.
with well, the grizzly has bare hands. The man or woman has knife.
Yeah, I feel like that levels the playing field a little bit more, maybe. But if you're not Anthony Hopkins, most people who hunt now are using much more high-tech weaponry to hunt. I'd be terrified to see if we started seeing hound hunting of bears in Wyoming and other states. We know that those states are open to running over wolves with snowmobiles. I can only imagine what else they would open the door to if Grizz were downlisted.
Yeah, absolutely. So listen, Florida man, if you are hearing this, you need to contact your congressmen and women and say, we've come up with a compromise. We will delist, but you have to use a knife only, and Florida man will be here with next to Donnie Jr. in a minute.
In a in one moment. And I think that, that makes it a bit of a more of a fair chase situation, if you will, with the grizzly bear.
So that wraps up our news for today. And we are really excited about today's guest. And Sam, do you want to tell us all about Dr. Marc Bekoff?
Oh my gosh. Dr. Marc Bekoff, the man, the myth, the legend. He has done such excellent research on the emotional lives of animals. He is a brilliant, brilliant resource for all things animal sentience. And today we get to talk to Marc a bit about wolves and the emotional lives of wolves and wolf packs, and then also more about his research on the emotional lives of animals. So it's a great interview, and I welcome all of you to it.
We are here to talk about wolf reintroduction. This is the anniversary of wolves being reintroduced to Colorado. And I'm so glad that I have both of you here to talk about that today. It's a tough subject for a lot of us in a lot of different ways. But I'd love to kick us off. This time last year, and Marc, I was reviewing journal entry I wrote on this date last year. How are you feeling, and what were your thoughts on wolf reintroduction a year ago compared to where we are now?
Yeah, well, I was at the first reintroduction for a lot of reasons, but one is because I wanted to really be there and see if there were personality differences among the 5 wolves who were released the very first day. Also because I've been studying these animals and other carnivores for a really long time. Well, I was really open before the reintroduction and was very hesitant about whether Colorado could really pull it off without killing wolves or having wolves be killed. So when I was there, though, it was really well done. I mean, CPW did a really good job of getting the wolves, transporting them, releasing them. It was moving. It was just amazing to be there and watch these wolves come out of their cages and run off. But, I was hesitant before because most people, if you're not doing this, they don't know the difficulties of pulling these projects off. There's biological, behavioral and ethical questions. You're basically robbing Peter to pay Paul. You're breaking up wolf packs wherever the animals are coming from, in this case, Oregon, and bringing them to Colorado on their own. So there was a brother and a sister from each of 2 litters and an older male who was the last animal to be released. So you've got the transport, you've got the stress of doing it. You're breaking up wolf packs where they have been living as cohesive units, and you're bringing them and, you're dumping them out somewhere and hoping they'll make it. So, yeah, I was really concerned about their survival and questions like that.
And did you notice any of those personality differences that you were looking for among the wolves as they were being released?
Yeah. I mean, 2 ran out. One was hesitant. One was very hesitant. And the last male just took off almost before the door was slid up, so that he could run away. So some of them are subtle, but among my research interests would be to look how even subtle differences in personality might affect later behavior, including what new wolves would do in Colorado, in their new homes. And when I studied wild coyotes for years, when the pups came out of the den at give or take 21 days of age, there were distinct personality differences. Bold, shy, obnoxious. I mean, I would some you wish you wouldn't see again, but you wish them well. So, yeah.
So with the different personality types, is it one of the things where it takes all types to be successful, or is it you want shy wolf in a certain area or a bold wolf in another?
Yeah, that's a great question. In terms of the formation of social groups, say like a wolf pack, you really want a diversity of personalities. You don't want all alphas, if you will, and sometimes the lowest ranking animals in a group are called omegas. So you want some kind of blend of different personalities. It's like, let's take a sport. You want guards, forwards, and centers. In basketball, you want different personalities for these. So yeah, and it could depend on different habitats. In many species, it surprises people that bold animals who you would think would do better don't, because they're brazen, they're arrogant, they go out, they get in trouble. Sometimes, like among rodents, they may get hit by cars, or they don't heed the warnings of going after, room service like animals like cows or sheep, for example. So it's a great question, and it really depends on context, who the animals are, where they are, and in the case of wolves, what's the nature of their food source, distribution, and amount.
So was that bold male, was he one of the animals that ended up being involved in conflict then down the line?
I was trying to figure this out, to be honest with you, and I don't think so. The male who was trapped, caged, and died was actually from the second group who were released.
Okay. So to rewind then, before we get to the trap, caged, and died, we've let wolves go. We're all optimistic, if not reserved about it, right? I wrote down, I'm so excited wolves do belong here, but I also was very worried about the human element of wolf reintroduction. To me, that's the toughest component of this, is that we've got people with all sorts of different personalities and values that are on the ground, some who want wolves here and some who do not, and that these animals end up standing for so much more than what they are. They're really animals trying to live their lives, but they end up becoming symbolic of different culture wars and different issues. And in a lot of different ways, the press picked up on that too. So over this past year, what has happened to define wolf reintroduction in Colorado and to create this narrative around wolves?
Well, at first, there were 10 wolves running around trying to live. They had to find food, find an area where there would be, no other wolves with whom to compete, or cougars or bears, avoid people, stay off of ranches and farms. So I would imagine that when they were released, once they stopped running away from the release site, they were looking around and going, what the hell's going on here? Because, they would likely know pretty fast this wasn't their home in Oregon. I mean, they would know that. But other than that, so they'd have to find food. They'd have to find a safe place to rest and live. And that could be very difficult, certainly in the areas where they were released, although they were very rural and, some were totally unpopulated. They were novel places. And I think the wolves were really highly stressed. And when we get back to it, that's what makes the formation of the Copper Creek pack almost a miracle. I never would have ever predicted that, although, of course, it was possible, but I didn't think it was going to happen in the first year. And it would have been within 4 or 5 months. They usually breed in February, so it would have been within 2 to 3 months that 2 wolves met one another. They got married, they had children, and very successful. 5 pups.
Right. That's a lot of pups, too.
It's a lot of pups.
Yeah.
In areas that are not user-friendly. They're really not.
Yeah, and I was very celebratory about that. I thought, wow, this is incredible. We've not only brought them back, but now they've actually settled down with each other and they're doing what we could have hoped for them to do. And I thought there was a piece missing there, and that there was no communication with the public on how exciting that was. At least not from social media or a traditional media narrative. We weren't getting the excitement, or we weren't celebrating, how well these wolves were doing.
Mm-hmm.
And we also weren't talking about all of the benefits that wolves can bring back on the landscape too, to these communities of humans that are living with them. Where do you think we fell short there? You wrote an excellent article on what the media has done with wolves in Colorado, and I'd love for you to chat about that a bit.
Yeah, well, I started just, on the side making little notes, plus, pro, con. And the con column was about, 97 give or take percent, it could have been 95, 92, but more than 90% of the media on the wolves were negative. And then when it was clear that they formed a pack and were having children, it was even more negative. And that's when I really made a firm decision to celebrate it. And you're absolutely right. I would have expected the people behind this to have lit candles and written countless articles about how successful it was. That may have turned some people who were anti-wolf, and it may have turned some people who were kind of on the edge thinking, oh my goodness, now we have 5 more wolves potentially on the ground. But I definitely agree. But, there was no transparency about just about anything. And so the public becomes very skeptical. And if you're already against wolves and you're either not being told the truth or not being told anything, it's easy to understand why people became downright anti-wolf.
Yeah. And to rewind a little bit about the formation of the Copper Creek Pack, I think about personal experiences I've had. So I was in the Peace Corps and I moved to Zambia in Africa. And, I went over with a group of folks that we didn't know each other before, but then we were super close and bonded because of this life-altering experience. And I wonder how much of the, oh my God, I'm in a place I don't recognize, there's another wolf over there, if that expedited the bonding process because of the heightened chaos in their lives. And they found each other to kind of set some of their anxieties at ease.
Yeah, it's like misery likes company. Yeah, it could have been, it could have just been 2 wolves, a male and a female in this case, who found one another in a common area because the common area may have offered a safe place to be and sleep, and there would have been plenty of food. There's lots of elk out where they are. So yeah, and then I think, forming that bond, especially if females in heat, it's going to be accelerated by that, because that's, breeding season, give or take February. So yeah, it's hard to know what really brought them together. It could have been chance, or it just could have been they actually were seeking one another out, not necessarily as individuals. But when there's a clumped food source like wolves, like the elk, and possibly livestock, it's not surprising that they would gravitate to a common area.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I wanted also, you mentioned children, and I know how much you focus on terminology.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like for you to just expand a little bit where you call wolves mom and dad and their offspring children versus alphas and offspring and all of that. So if you would just kind of share your thoughts around terminology.
Sure. What we think about non-human animals is reflected in our words, and our words lie behind our actions. And so I work really closely with Jane Goodall, and when she studied chimpanzees, or began studying them in the 60s, she named them and she gave them personalities. And then when she went back to University of Cambridge in the UK, they told her, we don't do this. And I wasn't there for the discussions, but clearly Jane must have said, well, I do this. And that was the beginning. And that actually had a huge influence on me in grad school because Jane's husband at the time, Hugo van Leeuwen, who was the National Geographic photographer who really brought a lot of attention to her. I would see him when he was in the US and we talked about that. And so early on, I just was calling animals who or whom or he, she, not it, which, or they, for example. So when you name an animal, most people who have dogs or cats name them. I do know somebody who gave their dog a number, but it was simply because it was their favorite number. But we typically name them. And so, yeah, I mean, if I had had more time with these wolves in Colorado, which I really didn't want in the end, I wanted them to just go off, be left alone, and do what wolves do. You know, I could have named them based on their behavior when they were released. You know, so that's really important and right. I mean, scientific jargon objectifies animals. And so scientists will call babies young or offspring. So I just started using the word children years ago, and I was told I couldn't publish a paper somewhere. And I said, well, then I'm not going to publish with you. And they relented. And I don't mean that in a nasty way. Because if you look at the evolution of parental care, I mean, these are their children, just like if you have a baby, they're your child. No human I know says, well, let me tell you about my offspring.
Well, depends on the day, Mark.
No, I know that. I know that. Having been around kids, but yeah, so words are really important. They talk about, one word that's abused all the time is euthanasia. Healthy animals they're murdered or killed when they do something wrong. They're not euthanized because euthanasia means you have interminable pain or, a disease that just an incurable disease. And that really gets me. And for what happens in some zoos, not many in America, but quite a number in Europe, they kill otherwise healthy animals who can't fit into their breeding system. So I coined the term zoothanasia rather than euthanasia. And it's actually pretty much caught on now, although a lot of people don't like it, but too bad. But that's really important because when you talk about urban animals like bears or cougars, a bear was euthanized in Boulder because they were a pain. No, they weren't. They were murdered. They were killed. They were slaughtered. The bear didn't do anything but be a bear. And the bear was remarkably healthy, for example. So in answer to your question, words count. Another word that I really despise is depredate.
I was just going to bring that up, Mark. I hate that word. I hate it.
Years ago when I was studying coyotes, I would work with people from the equivalents of Fish and Wildlife or Parks and Wildlife, and they started using it. And I looked it up. The word depredate means violent. And of course, people will say, well, when a wolf attacks a cow or an elk, it's violent. Well, that's ridiculous. It looks violent, but the wolves just have to eat. So I don't use the word depredate, but I actually think there's people who use it now because they do think of the violence of predation. And yes, you could look at it as violent, but you're also looking at it as a necessity. Wolves are carnivores. Big cats are carnivores. They can't go to the local deli or food shop and buy their breakfast, lunch, and supper. So that word, it really irritates me because it, among some people even I know, it elicits sorrow. Oh, wow, they had to be euthanized. And so that would be another word that is just...
To be fair, though, a few years ago in Chicago, there was a coyote that went into a blimpie into the walk-in cooler there. So to say that carnivores don't go into your local deli, it's a general rule.
No, I know that. And there was a coyote who regularly got on a bus in Seattle and the drivers said fine. It was really remarkable. And I had it was in the papers, but I used it in something I wrote. But yeah, so they could go into a Blimpies or some some restaurant, but they typically don't.
Typically.
Yeah, I'm really glad we mentioned those words. And I do want to talk a bit about animal sentience and the different personalities that animals have, like the bus riding coyote or the other coyote who I guess was into fast food. We had a bear in Grand Lake who was into gift shopping, and he'd walk through gift shops. And that often gets animals in trouble. But with wolves, one thing that makes wolves my absolute favorite animal is really their capability for emotion and how much they are invested in taking care of their families and
Yeah.
how far they will go to take care of their families, even at their own peril.
No, that's a great question. I mean, they're highly emotional, highly sentient. I mean, the word sentient just means the ability to feel. You can beat it around and write books and books on it, but everything really boils down that it's the ability to feel. So there's no doubt that wolves are highly sentient, highly emotional, and extremely intelligent. And that's really apt for you to say, Samantha, because that's among the reasons, and there's a lot others, I suppose, why it was to me so egregious to break up the Copper Creek pack was, there originally was a plan, which is just, I don't even have a word to describe it, to kill both of the adults and then put the pups in captivity. And that was thankfully not followed. But breaking up that pack was a disaster emotionally. And I know people laugh about it, you're just being anthropomorphic. I have no idea what that word really means anyway, but although I do, but I never would say that. But yeah, you're asking a great question. I mean, if you, once again, as an ethologist and an evolutionary biologist, you look at the evolution of different behavior patterns, highly evolved parental strategies, which means there's a close bond between the parents and their children, highly evolved protective responses to protect their family. So, when you really start to think about the stress that the individuals in the Copper Creek family were feeling, it's reprehensible. They lost their father. The pups lost their mother. Well, no, sorry. They lost the father. But if the plan to kill the mom and dad had gone off, they would have lost both parents, and then they'd be thrown in cages somewhere. And people go, well, they're not cages, they're enclosures. Well, they're cages. Their movement is restricted compared to what they had, in the wild. So the analogy I always draw is, would you do it to your dog?
Right. And I think that's smart. I always think of that one example. It was out of some research from Yellowstone where they had done a necropsy on a wolf who died of natural causes. And they had found that the wolf's jaw had been broken and healed. And the only way that wolf could have survived that was by its pack actually regurgitating food and feeding that wolf as if it were a pup to nurse it back to health, and then for it to survive that long and then die of natural causes. And I think wolves do that in a way that's important for folks to understand. And I hate the word anthropomorphic because it's really, how can we take the humanness out of our interactions with wildlife and with other animals? I absolutely hate that word. I think it's used to justify a lot of horrific activities.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Brian May of Queen has a great definition that says that. He says anthropomorphism is just a word that people use to excuse their horrific treatment of non-human animals. And you're right, so it's not only, say, if you have a broken jaw, you could be ill, you could have a broken leg. I mean, when we were studying coyotes, we had thousands of hours of observations over 8.5 years. You see all these kinds of things. And some people will say, well, they're rare. Well, it doesn't matter if they're rare. These animals mate once a year. And if they don't mate once a year, there's no more babies, no more, of that particular group. But, you'll see them take care of a wounded individual. Maybe an individual had a bad night or a bad day and has a headache and doesn't go hunt, which occurs. A lot of times when people say, well, that was unusual behavior, I wonder why. And when you offer the explanation that it could be emotional, they used to laugh at you. They don't laugh at you anymore. I mean, all the research that's been done, in the last decade or two, shows that these animals have deep, deep feelings. But to me, when you look at what happened to the Copper Creek pack, their sentience and emotions were totally ignored.
Right.
And some people said, well, they really cared for them. Well, if you really care for them, leave them alone. And if they suffered and if they were ill-fated on their own, that's part of being a wild animal.
Right. And I think that for us in Colorado, we made a commitment to those wolves when we brought them here by separating them from their original families. And we have really failed on that commitment to that family in particular and beyond. We started out with 10 wolves. We're down to 6 now. And to think of the Copper Creek pack, which, the backstory of that is there were livestock predations involved. And so Colorado Parks and Wildlife, rather than really setting a firm boundary on we're going to coexist with wolves, we're going to support this pack, or family, we're going to ensure their success, and we're going to work with you, humans, to make sure that happens. Rather than do that, it's as if the agency became apologists to the ranching community rather than really working for the wolves. And that was to both the wolves and the ranching community's detriment, right? At the end of the day, it didn't serve either community. And I think that that's our big failure in wolf reintroduction and got us to where we are now with Copper Creek, where we've got, dad's dead. We don't know exactly how he died. Mom's in captivity with 4 of 5 pups. And we missed one pup somehow, whoopsie, where there's one pup that's an orphan out there, probably dead, because God knows how that pup could fend for itself out there. And then we still have a ranching community that's upset and frustrated and is still unhappy with the agency. And so on all fronts, we've let everyone down. And I don't know how we come back from that and how we do right by wolves in the future, especially as we're considering more releases.
Yeah, you've hit so many key points, Samantha. We brought them here. We took them from their homes. We put them out here. So we're responsible for them. Part of being responsible for them is doing everything we can to keep them alive, and surely not capturing them and putting them in cages. I mean, to me, that's just absurd. We want wild wolves here. We want wild wolves living wolf-appropriate lives, right? Well, then that's what they're going to do. And I understand the plight of a lot of the ranchers. So I mean, I'm not, but to me, it became clear, especially around the time when the trap and relocate operation was already going. I mean, it was already going, but no one knew about it. And the only reason the word got out was because there was reports that there was going to be a leak by the Associated Press. And that's the only reason they went public. So, yeah, right. I mean, they took the wolves, they demolished the pack because of complaints by ranchers, and particularly, where this Copper Creek pack had denned. Well, of course they den there. It's room service. I mean, we have selected out all the anti-predatory behaviors of, quote, livestock. I don't like that word, but, so I can understand both sides. But to me, it was really apparent that the requests from, say, not everybody, but a large part of the ranching community were not going to decrease. Okay, fine. They have a right to do that. But taking the pack, part of the expectation was the next day there would be no more demands. Well, that was ridiculous. So that didn't work. And so because the probability was so low that something like this could happen, I like to say that all the Copper Creek pack with the DNA of future wolves in Colorado. It also set a precedent. I know that people are saying it's not precedent setting, but we've all been around long enough to know that if you do something, there's going to be expectations in the future you will do the same thing. So that's why, I mean, from day one, before a wolf hit the ground, I was non-lethal. And my feeling is, if that had really been prominent and a firm decision, a lot of people would have done more than they have done to protect their livestock.
Yeah, I found taking lethal off the table and then providing access to resources, I feel like that's the best solution to me. And it's tough. It's tough for the agency to implement, right? And again, on the human level, it's tough for the agency to say, no, we're not going to kill a wild animal you're having problems with. It's tough for ranchers who extirpated wolves in the first place because they didn't want issues with them. But at the end of the day, if we take that off the table, and for me, every time I look at a wolf plan, I think it should be off the table. No lethal, no hunting season for wolves. That's absurd.
Yeah.
And then how do we support our human and wolf communities to coexist with each other as state agencies? And answer that question after we take lethal off the table. And I haven't seen a state agency successfully do that yet. California has done pretty well by wolves. They've had a lot of wolf expansion into the southern part of California now. That's exciting. They do celebrate when they have wolves develop new families, and they do celebrate when wolves expand in California. They also have banned lion hunting in California too. So I guess we've got a few good things coming out of California, and yet they're not being overrun by wolves and lions. How can we do better by wolves here going forward in Colorado and in other Western states?
Yeah. I mean, those are huge questions. You know, a paper that I wrote called The Slippery Slopes of Reintroduction was really to educate the masses about the difficulties of these projects and all the biological, behavioral, and ethical complications. I mean, in the best of all possible worlds, since there's plans to bring more wolves back, and I don't know how you would mandate it. I'm not a legislator. I'm not a lawyer. I just don't know. But I would say lethal's off the table, and here's what we're providing you. And if need be, put more resources, if you will, into getting ranchers to do certain things, and that could, I mean, I can't imagine that the trap and relocate program didn't cost a lot of money. So that money could have easily been gone into education, but on the ground, like maybe range riders, maybe people out there, and maybe they're doing all this. I'm not saying they're not, but if lethal comes off the table, in any part of life, if you say you can't do that, you can't run a stop sign. So since it's planned that more wolves are coming, I would be extremely upfront to say no killing. I mean, there's going to be all legal suits and people are going to go crazy about it. And I don't know how you would initiate that, but I don't have to. I'm not part of that program, but that's, what I would do. So, I would have a hands-off policy. The wolves are going to do things we don't like, and the wolves are going to do things we do like. And one of the bases for that too falls under the umbrella of an ever-growing conservation strategy called compassionate conservation. It's growing globally. And the first tenet of compassionate conservation is first do no harm. And the second of four is the life of every individual matters. So when you start focusing on the value of every individual, because they're alive, they have inherent or intrinsic value. In a sense, it doesn't even matter if they're sentient. But with wolves, they're sentient and emotional and, brilliant beings. So when you focus on if you will, the right of every individual to exist, then you've got to protect them. And what I hear on the ground, because I write a lot for popular audiences and I interact with people who are really interested, is, well, the bumper stick would be, why in the world did you bring them here if you're not going to give them 100% protection? I mean, really simple. It's not going into deep philosophy or deep behavioral ecology. It's more, if you brought them here, you're responsible. If I take you out for dinner or I put you in my car, I'm responsible for your well-being.
Absolutely.
That's good to know, Mark. If you take me out to dinner, you're responsible for my well-being. I like that.
Well, in most cases. Anyway.
So I have
yeah.
a couple of questions along compassionate conservation
Okay, good.
and reintroductions. One, how does it work to value the life of an individual, but separate that individual from their family to reintroduce in another state?
Right. That's one of the first aspects of what happens in reintroduction or repatriation projects. There's a huge ethical question there. You're right. I mean, it begins before the project leaves the ground. Right. And so we break up an existing wolf pack to move some individuals elsewhere. That's what I mean. We're robbing Peter to pay Paul. Nobody really knows what happens to these wolf packs from which these animals are taken. And it would be nice to know, because we know that taking wolves out of a wolf pack could really demolish the pack, especially if they're leaders, for example. So that's a really good question. Before the operation begins, the ethics and biology should take first priority, so who knows? Maybe have we demolished these packs in Oregon just to form packs here, and then we demolish the first pack here. So these wolves have paid a really heavy price. And what I like about that question, Mark, also is the wolves are the primary stakeholders.
Right.
That's actually another tenet of compassionate conservation, is the animals are the primary stakeholders. It's their lives that are at stake. So you have to answer those questions. And really, when you do a nitty-gritty analysis of the different steps in a reintroduction or repatriation program, the slippery slopes, you might decide not to do it. And it's among those reasons why I was on the fence. I voted for the ballot issue. I wasn't going to, but I voted because I wanted it to go to the people and see what they said, because the people we own habitats.
Right.
You could say the state owns them, but the state is made up of people. So yeah, it's a great question.
Yeah. And then my follow-up on that is the slippery slope of, well, so we're bringing wolves to Colorado and we want to do no harm, but by having them here, inherently, we're going to do harm to elk, possibly to livestock. And, it's not the wolves' fault for no longer living in Colorado before the reintroduction, except for a handful. But the fact was, the elk and the livestock and everybody else would be happy to not have the wolves here and possibly be killed by them. So, it's a difficult ethical question, I think, when you really dive into it. I'd just like to get your thoughts on the elk's perspective.
Right. Well, that was, because I wrote about that. You're going to have prey animals subjected to predation by animals who never were here. I mean, you could also make the same argument if you wanted to bring in more cougars or some animal. You're subjecting them to increased pressures of predation. So that's an ethical question. Some people would say, well, the elk have not retained their anti-predatory repertoire to wolves. I'm not sure. I don't know about that, but the elk do have anti-predatory strategies against cats, which they could probably use with wolves. Okay, but it's a question that elk are now being subjected, or any prey animal, to heightened predation when they would not have. And you could say the same for domestic cows and sheep and other food animals. Now there's increased predation. So what are people going to do about it? You certainly, depending where you live, you certainly cannot just maintain the status quo if there's going to be wolves around. I mean, it's really simple. So, that's among the sort of the ethical meal plan. And people have laughed at me for that, but it's just true. They'll say, well, elk have evolved as prey. Well, I understand that. In the best of all possible worlds, we wouldn't have predators and prey, but we do. So just because they've evolved as prey what right do we have to increase, if you will, the demands on their lives? And that's exactly what is happening.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Mark. And I think so to add another layer to this, I always go back to the greater good of it all, right? For healthy ecosystems and for fitness of elk herds and for the long lasting health of herds, we need that predation piece and they need that predation piece, or they could have more suffering and more dying from disease and from other ailments. So at the end of the day, the wolves are providing a service in a way they were designed to do to keep those herds healthy in the long haul.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's apt because, people talk about ecological services. I don't like that word because I don't really know what it means sometimes. But you're right. I mean, predator-prey relationships have evolved over time, localized, in certain areas. So there might be different predation pressures, say in Colorado versus Yellowstone, for example. So what's happening in Yellowstone is fascinating, but Colorado ain't Yellowstone. And by the way, that was just something I said from day one when, people would say, well, they made it in Yellowstone. Well, yeah, it's a national park and it's a huge national park. But I think what Samantha's saying is really true, that in a hands-off approach, things are going to happen that you don't like. And, in the sense, maybe you don't like seeing a lot of predation. Maybe you don't like seeing wolves fight one another or cougars fight one another or cougars kill wolves. I don't like it, but that's what's going on out in the wild. And we step in, we're intruding into their lives. And oftentimes the intrusions are very local but we have no idea about the widespread effects. So you could argue that, you have a wolf pack, say near Glenwood Springs, and you do something to it. That could affect wolves across Western Slope because they travel, they know what's going on in different areas. So messing locally can have a real large effect globally, if you will. So
that makes sense.
And so, this discussion reaffirms in my mind and my heart, really, we should just leave them be. That's all. I mean, I get so upset when I think that we had a breeding family group. They were doing okay. The male may have had an injured leg before it all happened, and he had lost a lot of weight, but he was able to mate, have babies, and feed them. And the thing is, when I studied coyotes, we would see individual coyotes in the sorriest of shape. They break legs, they twist their legs, they might have a fight and have a cut all along their side. And for the most part, they survive. Some do die, but that's part of the natural system. So faulting wolves for being wolves, yanking them out of the wild, putting some in a cage, having that one pup run free, to me, was biologically and ethically unsound.
Yeah, I agree. And I have to share a little story about coyotes getting hurt. So one of my favorite coyotes in the world is this guy named Tripod, and he lives in the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone.
Mm-hmm.
And I've seen him where he comes up to the road and he looks so sad and pitiful and he's limping. And he had got hit by a car a couple of years ago and managed to recover. But he apparently has this limp for life, or at least that's what one would suspect. Unless you hang out with Tripod long enough, a friend of mine told me he watched Tripod at the road doing his little sad, limpy, sad dog face. And then as he left the road and was far enough away that he thought no one was watching, he just trotted off.
Mm-hmm. Right.
He learned it was a great way to get handouts.
Well, I love that story because it can bear on Tripod's personality, his emotional intelligence. He knows exactly what he's doing.
Yeah.
I mean, we saw things like that in our long-term study of coyotes. I saw stuff like that. I studied penguins in Antarctica, and they are masters at stealing stones from others' nests. And you've got these bold ones who run in and just take the stone and get chased, and they'll squabble. And then you have the real, the real canny ones that go in and they'll look around and they'll get a stone and then they'll run away. and all shades of gray, between those two strategies. So yeah, they know exactly what they're doing. You'll watch individuals in a wolf pack or a coyote pack. They spend about 90% of the day resting. So they're looking around and they're getting a lot of information. They know a lot about the behavioral profiles and personalities of every other wolf. And sometimes they'll do stuff and, people would say, well, they did it. They must have known that Joe or Mary wasn't here, or what they were doing. And yeah, they did know, by the way.
And so I know we're running out of time. I wanted to get your thoughts on, so we have up to 15 more wolves coming in early next year in the beginning of 2025. And how does that look as far as, do you suspect there will be any conflicts with the wolves that are out right now? If they don't have packs, are they less likely to have conflicts? So what are we looking at in this next reintroduction?
Yeah, I expect that if they cross paths, there will be conflicts because they're competitors. Yeah, I mean, very simple. And so who knows what that will mean? You know what I mean? And under the regulations now, they're going to have major conflicts with human mammals. So that's going to affect their spatial distribution, for example. And so when you throw in the fact that they're going to have wolves out there and cougars and bears, other animals with whom they're going to compete, sure, and of course, in the best of all possible worlds, it's possible that a newcomer this year may mate up and make a family with a wolf who's on the ground. But the precedent that's being set is not very promising. And so I'm very concerned. I mean, it just, to me, frankly, I hope it all goes well. Like I had hoped the original release would have gone well, but with more wolves, an increase in the density of wolves per, say, square mile or whatever, and not necessarily more food. I mean, there's plenty of elk out there for them. I just don't see how they're going to have good, safe lives unless we decide that lethal is off the table. So that's where I come down. And, people say, I've had people get on me and say, you don't really want wolves here. Yeah, I really do want wolves here. I want live wolves here. And once again, I want to reiterate, I understand where the ranchers are coming from, but allowing the wolves to be killed. And think of the economics of it. These projects are so expensive. So people have said to me, well, that money could have gone into improving habitat. It could have been, gone into other types of park and or wildlife issues, which is true. So the person power, the transportation, and everything else, the educational programs, they're not free. So I don't know. I'm just really, really, I'm not on the fence. I hope I'm wrong because I love being wrong in these situations, but I can't imagine there won't be much more intensified human wolf conflict if 15 wolves come back.
I hope we have the uplifting story at some point of the fifth pup made it through the winter. Like, having a sympathetic wolf, I think, could do a lot of good for the PR program around them, and saying, man, this little guy had his whole family taken away. His father died, and he found a way to survive through the winter.
Well, like any story, though, there's another side, because anti-wolf people will go, see how hardy they are?
Right.
This wolf, has an Arnold Schwarzenegger profile. And we need to be concerned about that because they could live through everything. But I agree with you, Mark. And it's also possible that, if they this wolf makes it through, and they know who the wolves are, then there's another potential father because he definitely will be fertile.
Right.
And fit for after surviving a
Yes.
winter by himself.
Right. There's a hypothesis in biology called the good genes hypothesis. And the good genes hypothesis basically say that females are seeking out the males with the best genes. And among elephant seals, the larger males tend to produce 99% of the offspring. It's not like the females go, you weigh this much and you weigh this much, so you must have better genes. But that's how natural selection works. So you're right. If it's a male, he's male, yeah, makes it through the winter, he's showing that he's pretty good.
Right. Yeah.
I'm rooting for him.
I
Mark. I'm
am
rooting
too.
for him.
No. And really, I understand the difficulties of doing this. I've done field work, but they put so much effort into the trap and relocate problem. Yeah. Well, that's a good slip operation that it's hard to know that they couldn't find this male. I understand that it's not totally 100% possible to do. So I will celebrate his life just like I would celebrate the formation of the Copper Creek Pack and their children if he makes it through.
Me too.
Yeah, absolutely. And Mark, you're asking folks to do something today for the 1-year anniversary of wolf reintroduction and wolf release. Can you share what that thing is? And that way, whenever folks hear this, they can also do this and honor wolves that way.
Yep. Light a candle. I mean, it's funny because the idea came to me on a ride. I'm not good about dates, but when I was riding, I realized, the first 5 wolves were released 1 year ago today, December 18th. So I just, it was cold. I was on a long ride and my mind started going and I said, they should just light a candle. So I actually wrote most of it while I was writing, but I'm really touched. I've gotten so many nice texts and emails about it. It's something everyone can do, as Samantha's pointing out. I'm not asking you to donate $1,000. I'm not asking you to go out and howl at the full moon. I'm asking you just light a candle in honor of of course, not only the Copper Creek Pack, but all the wolves who are out there. So,
Yeah.
I will light my candle momentarily.
Yeah, no, seriously. We can't, the other thing, another reason is we can't let the wolf issue die. We cannot let it slide away. And that's what I think a lot of people want to happen. No, we cannot let it slide away. We need to stay on top of it. I always say, and I really feel this, we work for the wolves, for the animals, not against people. It's clear that raising certain issues of concern have had basically zero effect. And that's okay. Work for the wolves. That's all. We're responsible for their lives.
You're absolutely right, Mark. And we appreciate you being here today. I just sent you a video of my candle that I lit for the wolves today and shared a post with it. And I think it's important that we think of all of these different elements. Are you lighting your finger on fire by touching a fake candle, Mark?
No, there was music with it.
There was music. I did put music with it. No, I put Eddie Vedder's song from Into the Wild that I love so much that I play each time before I go on a wild expedition. I thought it was fitting for the wolves. But no, thank you so much, Mark. You're an inspiration. I love how you think about animal lives. And I love having these kinds of conversations with you because we can really talk about the nuances both in humans and in wild animals. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate you, other Mark with a K.
And thank you, Sam. What was a key takeaway for you today?
I think my takeaway for today, my number one takeaway though, is that animals have this really rich emotional life. Each animal does. And what we've done with Colorado's wolves is just crazy making when we think about how much these animals feel and how we actually trapped and put wolves into captivity that had a whole family life that did everything that wolves were supposed to do here other than eat cows. I think that's really sad. So for me, the one takeaway for me is let's not break up wolf families. Let's support wolf recovery And wolves have deep, rich emotional lives, and we should be supporting those lives and really fostering coexistence.
Absolutely. Yeah. And my takeaway is something so small that you just don't even think of. When you talked about a coyote that maybe wasn't hunting that day, and maybe he or she had a headache. It's like, oh my God, of course. Like, I don't want to do anything when I have a headache. And so just putting that perspective in there of, yeah, they don't just wake up, go hunt, and then go to sleep. They might wake up and be like, oh, this is a rough day. We've all been there before.
We have, but the cool thing is that the other coyotes then take care of him. He's not hunting, and the other family members will step up in those situations, which is really cool to think about.
Yeah, it is. So just a remarkable human being that is out there sharing his wealth of knowledge with us, and really diving into the sentience of all our beautiful neighbors. So we couldn't be more thrilled to have Dr. Marc Bekoff on our podcast, and we look forward to having him again in the future.
Yep. Until next time, keep it wild.
This has been an episode of the Wildlife Wire with Samantha Miller and me, Mark Searles. Thank you for listening. And here's a quick fact check of today's episode. While this was the first case of chronic wasting disease found in the National Elk Refuge in Jackson, Wyoming, chronic wasting has been found in elk populations in other parts of the state for about 20 years.